Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. Welcome to the press webinar for the launch of the the inaugural edition of the IEA's Global Hydrogen Review. My name is Jethro Mullen. I'm a senior writer and editor in the IEA communications team. I'm joined here by Timur Göl, the head of the IEA's Energy Technology Policy Division, and by our energy technology analyst, Jose Miguel Bermudez Menendez, who is one of the lead authors of the reports. They will be presenting the key findings from the report and then taking your questions. You can put your questions to us via the Q&A function in the Zoom. Feel free to send them at any point during the presentation or just after it. It would be very much appreciated if you could state your name and your publication when you enter your question in the Q&A function. So with that, I'll hand off to Timur Göl, who's going to get things underway. Thank you, Timur.
Thank you very much, Jose, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening also from my end. Welcome to today's press launch of the Global Hydrogen Review. I'm here with my colleague, Dr. Jose Bermudez. Really great pleasure to discuss the report's finding of this first edition of the report with you today. The Global Hydrogen Review that we are presenting today is an outcome of the IEA's Hydrogen Initiative, which is an initiative under the Clean Energy Ministerial, dedicated to accelerating the deployment of hydrogen worldwide. It was established at the Clean Energy Ministerial back in 2019, and within the initiative, the IEA facilitates exchanges between governments and with a variety of partners, including from the industry. We have actually carried out several practical implementation-oriented activities under this initiative over the last 2 years, in particular, for example, by building a global ports coalition. The report, the Global Hydrogen Review, as we call it, that we are launching today, is another concrete output. It builds on collaborations with the International Partnership for Hydrogen and Fuel Cells in the Economy, the Hydrogen Council, and with the Hydrogen and Advanced Fuel Cell Technology Collaboration Programs of the IEA. The report that we are presenting today is designed to inform policy discussions at Japan's Hydrogen Energy Ministerial that is taking place today as well. Now, so what does our report find? My colleague, Dr. Bermudez, will go through the findings in more detail one by one in a couple of minutes, but I wanted to highlight a couple of them already at the outset. The first point is that the report really underscores the political commitment to support the scale up of low carbon hydrogen that is much stronger than we have ever seen it before. When we released our landmark report on hydrogen called The Future of Hydrogen at the G20 summit in Japan 2 years ago on request of Prime Minister Abe, only 3 countries had strategies for hydrogen in place: France, Japan, and Korea. Today, 17 governments have released hydrogen strategies, and more than 20 additional governments have announced that they are working on their own ones. This is an important step, we believe, to tap into the opportunity low carbon hydrogen and hydrogen-based fuels such as ammonia, but also others, can bring to reducing emissions in the long run and support meeting climate goals, in particular net zero emission goals, which many countries have brought forward over the past 2 years, further boosting the case for hydrogen. The second point to highlight is indeed the impressive pipeline of projects, on the ground progress, that we are seeing for the production of low carbon hydrogen that we have managed to identify. These are projects where hydrogen is produced either from renewable electricity or from fossil fuels in combination with carbon capture, utilization, and storage. If all the projects in the pipeline were realized, then more than 17 million tons of low carbon hydrogen production could be produced by the year 2030 from next to nothing today. Europe and North America are set to become the leading actors, our report finds, on low carbon hydrogen production from where we stand today, from what we are seeing in terms of the concrete pipeline of projects. But we also see that pipeline of projects growing in other parts of the world, in particular in China, which is a reminder of the developments we saw with solar PV in the past, where similar kind of staggered progress happened in different parts of the world. Now, it is important to recognize that the current pipeline of projects is indeed very impressive, but still well below what is needed to align with the climate ambitions as we have identified them in our net zero emissions by 2050 roadmap that we released in May this year. Nonetheless, these projects are important. They are crucial stepping stones to develop supply chains and bring down the cost of production, low carbon hydrogen production and use over the next decade. And there is such a huge potential for cost reduction, as our report shows. Deployment of renewable electricity of the scale anticipated in our net zero roadmap could make renewable electrolysis cost competitive, even with fossil-based hydrogen by the year 2030 in regions with excellent renewable resources. But irrespective of this good progress that we are seeing, there are still important challenges to be taken note of. We find that government strategies will need to pay more attention to stimulating demand for hydrogen in new areas where hydrogen could actually make meaningful contributions to reduce emissions in the long run, from steel production to heavy duty trucks, from shipping to aviation. Some demonstration projects are underway and they're important and very encouraging in many ways, but without strong and targeted policy support, these new demands will not materialize at the required pace to meet climate ambitions. In closing, just to say from the IEA, we will continue to monitor progress on hydrogen, both for low carbon supplies as well as demand, and we will continue not only to analyze, but also to support actively hydrogen deployment through working with governments around the world to put in place the right policies to support them, including through our hydrogen initiative that I mentioned earlier. And with that, I will now pass the word to Dr. Bermudez, who will present the key findings from the IEA's new global hydrogen review. Jose, over to you.
Thank you very much, Timur. Good morning, afternoon, evening, everyone, and thanks for joining us today in this launch event of our first global hydrogen review. In the next few minutes, I will try to summarize the main findings of the report and to present you with the recommendations that the IEA wants to put forward to help governments and industry to tap into the opportunity that hydrogen offers for the clean energy transition. Back in 2019, we released our landmark report, The Future of Hydrogen, at the request of Japan's G20 president. And we found that there was an impressive momentum behind hydrogen, but there were still doubts whether the momentum for hydrogen had really arrived, since there have been other false starts in the past. Now, 2 years later, it is safe to argue that we are moving from momentum to implementation and to real-world action, and progress on the ground is reaching a pace that we have not seen before. Let me give you 3 indicators. First, governments all around the world are pushing for hydrogen. At the time we released the Future of Hydrogen report, only Japan, France, and Korea had strategies in place for the use of hydrogen. Today, 17 governments have released and adopted their hydrogen strategies, the last one, Colombia, last week. And at least another 20 governments have publicly announced that they are working actively on developing their own strategy. On the industrial sector, there is a response for this call for action, and there is an impressive appetite for investments to seize this opportunity. The Hydrogen Council announced that more than $300 billion have been announced in projects related to hydrogen by the industrial sector from now till 2030, and at least 80 of those billions have been already committed. Finally, international cooperation on hydrogen is mounting, and there is a growing number of bilateral and multilateral agreements between governments and industrial stakeholders, and several major initiatives are aiming at having established with the objective of deploying and accelerating the deployment of hydrogen technologies. It is difficult to pin down the exact reasons for this progress, but the fact that hydrogen can help us addressing climate change as a means towards a net zero emission system, and the fact that there are a growing number of governments and companies that are adopting such commitments is clearly one of the key drivers. Today, countries accounting for more than 70% of global CO2 emissions and more than 70% of global GDP have such commitments in place. These are a lot of developments, but as ever, the key questions are, is progress fast enough and is it pointing into the right direction, the direction in which required for hydrogen to play its role in this global fight against climate change? And these are the type of questions that we have tried to answer with this Global Hydrogen Review. To start off, let me remind you that hydrogen is already a major business. Our estimate is that in 2020, hydrogen demand accounted for 90 million tons, most of it coming from traditional applications in industry as a feedstock and in refining. The use of hydrogen as a fuel in new uses is still fairly limited only to road transport, which accounts for around 0.02% of total hydrogen demand. However, as we showed in our net zero emissions by 2050 roadmap released in May, hydrogen will need to play an important role in the transition to a net zero energy system. According to our net zero by 2050 and net zero emissions by 2050 scenario, hydrogen demand should grow sixfold by 2050, and its use should expand to new sectors, including long-distance transport, particularly heavy-duty trucks to complement the use of electricity, the use in aviation and shipping, both in the form as hydrogen and hydrogen-based fuels such as ammonia and synthetic hydrocarbons, new heavy industry applications like the production of carbon-free steel, or its use for power generation, with the objective of providing grid balance, a means to store electricity, and also a way to increase the shares of renewables that can be integrated in the system. With this in mind, to meet net zero emissions by 2050, hydrogen and hydrogen-derived fuels should meet more than 10% of final energy consumption, growing from less than 0.1% today. We need to be clear on this, and hydrogen is not a silver bullet. It is just one piece more of the puzzle that we need to put together to make sure that we meet net zero emissions by 2050, along with other key pillars of decarbonization, such as renewables, electrification, energy efficiency, carbon capture, utilization and storage, or sustainable biomass, and many others. To put this into context, electricity in our net zero scenario by 2050 meets 50% of total final energy consumption, so 5 times more than hydrogen. However, hydrogen is fundamental to reach net zero emissions in certain sectors where emissions are particularly hard to decarbonize, there are no other technological options, or they are particularly challenging to implement. This is where we should go, but where are we headed? Our analysis of current policies and announcements suggests that hydrogen demand is growing, but its expansion into new sectors is still very slow. Under current trends, hydrogen demand could grow up to 105 megatons by 2030, but most of this growth comes from traditional uses. The demand in refining is set to grow as this sector recovers the activity lost during the pandemic. In the chemical sector, a key demand driver is an increase in demand for ammonia, since it will be needed to produce larger amounts of nitrogen fertilizers to respond to population growth. In steel making, hydrogen demand is expected to grow as well due to the growing need for steel, particularly for the development of new infrastructure in emerging economies. We can also observe some initial developments in new uses. In road transport, the market for fuel cell electric vehicles is growing fast. In the last 3 years, it has grown sixfold. And there are several demonstration projects for the use of hydrogen in trucks, in shipping, in rail, in aviation, both in the form of hydrogen and hydrogen-derived fuels. The projected growth is still higher in fuel cell electric vehicles, but they remain far below the current expected growth of battery electric vehicles. In the chemical sector, a project for the use of variable renewables to produce hydrogen and subsequently to produce ammonia is expected to start operating this year in Spain, and there are several other projects in the scale of kilotons of hydrogen that are expected to become operational in the next 2 to 3 years. In the steel sector, this year, the first world pilot project to produce carbon-free steel using low-carbon hydrogen started operating in Sweden. And also this year in Japan, it has started a demonstration project for a 20% co-firing share of ammonia in a 1 gigawatt scale coal-fired unit, with demonstration expected to be completed by 2025. Nonetheless, all these encouraging steps fall short of what is needed to put the world or the energy system on track to meet net zero emissions by 2050. However, it is clear that there is more to come. Looking at net zero pledges made by governments at what they mean for hydrogen demand, we think that demand could expand up to 120 megatons of hydrogen by 2030, and more than 10% of this demand should come from new uses. Meeting these pledges will require a step change in demand creation, which at itself requires more ambitious and concrete policy actions. Governments are starting to announce a wide variety of policy tools, like carbon pricing, auctions, quotas, mandates, but practically none of these actions have been already entered into force. Their quick and widespread enactment will help to increase and scale up faster hydrogen demand. This is the demand side of the equation, but what happens with supply? Hydrogen today is still not the clean energy vector that it needs to be to help in climate goals. In 2020, practically all demand was met with production of hydrogen based on unabated fossil sources. This has resulted in close to 900 million tons of CO2 emissions, which is broadly equivalent to the combined emissions of the United Kingdom and Indonesia. The production of low carbon hydrogen was limited to less than 1 megaton, practically all of it coming from facilities using fossil fuels with carbon capture, utilization, and storage, and a small contribution of facilities using water electrolysis. However, the good news is that the number of announced projects is growing, and is growing at an impressive speed. Our analysis of the current project pipeline that we are tracking suggests that by 2030, we could be producing more than 17 million tons of low carbon hydrogen. Many of these projects are already at the advanced planning stages, but around a quarter of this pipeline is still at very early stages of development. So there is still uncertainty on those numbers. Regarding which are the main routes for production, according to the project pipeline, there is almost an even split between the projects that aim to produce hydrogen from water electrolysis and projects that aim to produce hydrogen from fossil fuels with carbon capture, utilization, and storage. But there are notable regional differences. Europe is leading the development on both fronts. On electrolysis, it is today the largest market and is expected to remain so in the near term, on the back of the ambitious strategies adopted by the European Union and the United Kingdom. On carbon capture, utilization, and storage, the United Kingdom and also the Netherlands are pushing to become leaders on the field and account for a major fraction of the projects currently under development. Australia has become a hotspot for the development of electrolysis projects, thanks to its good renewable resources and its potential to produce low carbon and low cost hydrogen to export to high demand centers in Asia, such as Japan and Korea. Today, 9 projects with a capacity, each one of them of more than 1 gigawatt of electrolysis, which it means around 170 kilotons of hydrogen, are under development in Australia, some of which are the largest projects currently announced. Latin America and the Middle East are also expected to deploy large amounts of capacity, also aiming to export hydrogen and ammonia. China made a slow start, but the number of projects announced is growing rapidly, most of the announcements coming just from this last year. This in many ways hints to what has happened with solar PV in the past. Regarding the production of hydrogen from fossil fuels with carbon capture, utilization, and storage, the United States and Canada account today for more than 80% of total production capacity, global production capacity, and this capacity is expected to grow significantly in both countries. Although their share decrease, their global share decreases due to developments in the rest of the world, they are expected to remain the global leaders by 2030. This large-scale deployment is, of course, critical to bring down the cost of producing low-carbon hydrogen, which today is its biggest barrier to compete with unabated fossil-based production of hydrogen, which is the cheapest route in most parts of the world. Producing hydrogen from natural gas, depending on regional gas prices, today it ranges between 0.5 and $1.7 per kilogram of hydrogen. Coupling fossil facilities with carbon capture, utilization, and storage means that the cost increases up to $1 to $2 per kilogram, and using renewable electricity means that producing hydrogen can cost between $3 and $8 per kilogram. The scale-up of hydrogen production, continued innovation, technology innovation, and the continuous decrease in renewable electricity costs suggest that the cost of producing hydrogen from renewable is set to decrease. The question is by how much and how quickly, which in turn strongly depends on the pace of the deployment of projects and that the policies are put in place. To give a sense by just how much cost could fall with ambitious policy, our net zero by 2050 scenario is a good proxy. Under such an ambitious policy framework, hydrogen from renewables could fall to $1.3 per kilogram in those regions that have excellent renewable resources, becoming and up to $3.5 per kilogram in the rest of the world. This can make renewable hydrogen competitive with the production of hydrogen from fossil fuels with CCUS just in the next decade, and even with unabated production in those regions with good renewable resources. Such a drop in cost can also kickstart development of a global hydrogen market, which can help countries with limited potential to deploy significant capacities of low carbon hydrogen production to meet their growing national demands with imports of hydrogen-based fuels from other regions. At the same time, it can provide an export opportunity to those regions with good renewable resources or with large CO2 storage potential. Some governments are already exploring this opportunity, with Japan leading the activities. We have recently witnessed 3 major milestones. In 2020, the first shipment of a liquid organic hydrogen carrier took place between Brunei and Japan. Also in 2020, for the first time, 40 tons of ammonia produced with fossil fuels and carbon capture, utilization, and storage were shipped from Saudi Arabia to Japan with the aim of using them as a fuel. And the first shipment of liquefied hydrogen have been announced to happen before March 2022 between Australia and Japan. Currently, there are more than 70 projects that have been announced aiming to export hydrogen and hydrogen-derived fuels, with at least 17 of them currently under development. These projects are heavily concentrated in the Asia-Pacific region, but there are some initial developments in Latin America, in North Africa, and in Europe. Let me finish with a brief explanation of the policy recommendations that we have outlined in the report. In 2019, in the Future of Hydrogen report, we already provided a series of key policy recommendations to scale up hydrogen, some of which are being materialized. These recommendations have not fundamentally changed, but we think that there is a need to strengthen the focus on certain areas. There is a need to keep developing and adopting strategies and roadmaps on the role of hydrogen in the energy system. These strategies should contain concrete targets for deploying low carbon production capacity and particularly to stimulate demand. This is critical to build stakeholder confidence about the potential marketplace for low carbon hydrogen in the future, to trigger investments and to accelerate deployment. There is also a need to create incentives for the use of low carbon hydrogen to displace unabated fossil fuels. Creation of demand, is lagging behind what is needed to put the world on track to meet net zero emissions. The use of low carbon hydrogen is more costly than its fossil counterparts, but there are already many regions in the world that are adopting carbon prices to close partially this gap. This is not enough to adopt low carbon hydrogen at the pace that the energy transition requires. This should be accompanied by other technology and other policy options, such as auctions, mandates, quotas for hydrogen-related specific requirements in public procurement. This can help industry to risk investments and accelerate the scale-up of hydrogen demand. We have to mobilize investments in production assets, infrastructure, and factories for the manufacturing of hydrogen technologies. A policy framework that stimulates demand can prompt investment in these areas, but not at the speed that it requires to meet climate goals. Further policy action will be needed. Providing tailor-made support to flagship shovel-ready projects can help in start building this low-carbon production, building new infrastructure, and creating the manufacturing capacities from which later projects can benefit. There is an urgent need to provide strong support to innovation to ensure that critical technologies reach commercialization soon. The story of the success of hydrogen is a story about innovation, which is essential to drive down the cost and increase competitiveness of hydrogen technologies. Unlocking the full potential demand for hydrogen will require strong innovation efforts over the next decade to make sure that these technologies become commercial and are ready to deliver CO2 emission savings at scale by 2030. Finally, we need to establish appropriate certification and standardization schemes and adapt the regulatory regimes. The adoption of hydrogen will result in development of new value chains that will require a modification of the current regulatory regimes and the definition of standards and certifications that can remove barriers that are preventing widespread adoption. We would like to highlight the need for an international agreement on a methodology for calculating the carbon footprint of hydrogen production. This is particularly important to ensure that hydrogen production is truly low carbon and to help in the development of a global low carbon hydrogen market. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Jose and Timur, for the presentation. For those of you in the journalists participating in the webinar, please submit your questions via the Q&A function in the Zoom. We're just going to take a short break to review the questions that have come in, and we'll come back to you very shortly. Looking forward to more questions coming from you soon. We'll be back shortly. Hi, everyone. Thank you for the questions so far. First of all, we have a question about the Hydrogen Energy Ministerial meeting that's taking place today that this report was launched to coincide with. What are the expectations for the Hydrogen Energy Ministerial? And then we also have a question about what market mechanisms does the IEA recommend for stimulating markets? How should CFDs be structured, e.g. difference to what? Fossil H2, CO2 content related? And sorry, that's from James Burgess from Platts. So I think, Timur, you're going to take the first question on the ministerial, and then Jose, the next one. And any other questions, please feel free to put them into the Q&A. Thank you. Over to you, Timur.
Yeah, thank you very much for the excellent question. And let me start out maybe by commending Japan for the excellent efforts it has been undertaken on hydrogen, as we laid out in our presentation. Today, many countries around the world are pushing the hydrogen agenda, and I think without Japan, I'm not sure we would be in the same place. Hydrogen, the Hydrogen Energy Ministerial is a key point here that was initiated by Japan just a couple of years ago, and that brings together leaders from around the world, from governments as well as from the industry, to support the hydrogen momentum, and also to work together in making good progress towards the global action agenda that Japan has set out. Japan has been really spearheading efforts under the G20 just 2 years ago, and we're really grateful for the opportunity at the time to work on the Future of Hydrogen report. We're going to come out with another report, in fact, this week on low emissions fuels, which also links very closely to the hydrogen agenda. Now, what are we expecting to come from the Hydrogen Energy Ministerial is obviously we want a strong continued support to the hydrogen agenda from all around the world. There are many governments taking action, putting in place or bringing forward their roadmaps, their long-term strategies for hydrogen, but now it's time for implementation. It's good to have a plan for the long term, but a plan is only as good as the action that is being taken on the ground. And as Dr. Bermudez showed in his presentation, there is a lot coming from hydrogen, but it's not yet aligned with the actual needs that we have in the energy sector to reach net zero emissions in the long term. So we hope that the fact that government leaders, industries, and many other stakeholders will come together there will help to overcome current deployment hurdles and bring forward more action both on low carbon hydrogen supplies as well as in boosting low carbon hydrogen demand. With that, second question over to you, Jose.
Thank you very much. Regarding market mechanisms to stimulate hydrogen markets, we think that policy action is needed, and we have highlighted some of the possibilities in the report. So creating mandates, quotas, hydrogen-specific requirements in public procurement, these can really kickstart the scale-up of hydrogen demand and definitely the markets. The carbon contracts for different, concretely carbon contracts for different, as it has been announced by the European Union and also by Germany, is another possibility that we think that needs to be accompanied with auctions to make sure that the most successful and more the projects with more potential are rewarded. But there is still a need to understand better how this can be structured. What we are clear is that it will be somehow different to what has happened with the contracts for difference in the electricity sector, but it's another good opportunity to stimulate hydrogen markets.
Thank you, Jose and Timur, for those answers. The next question we have is from Camilla Nachet from S&P Global. Her question is, blue hydrogen as a transition technology, how will projects be made net zero compatible at the back end of their life cycle? Do you expect early closures or carbon offset buying in 2050? If so, does that change the economics of blue hydrogen? Timur's going to take this one.
Yeah, thank you very much for the excellent question. And indeed, there's a lot of discussion around hydrogen produced from fossil fuels with CCS today. I think it's important to recognize where we stand. We have 900 million tons of CO2 emissions that are coming from hydrogen production today, and there is an opportunity for CCS technologies to reduce these emissions. Now, obviously, in all that, we need to make sure two things in particular. First is that in the upstream, methane emissions are being reduced significantly in order for hydrogen from CCS or from natural gas with CCS to play a role towards as a emissions or low emissions type of source. We have, as the IEA, been pushing for action on methane for quite some time, and there is a large share of methane emissions that can actually be reduced without any costs whatsoever. So there is a huge opportunity here to improve the case for so-called blue hydrogen. And the second one is obviously to make sure that carbon capture rates at the plants are sufficiently high. The theory of the case is that carbon capture at these type of plants can be 90 to 95%. Today, in theory, they can be even higher. So there's a lot of potential for hydrogen from fossil fuels with CCS to play a role. But the key point to make is here that these two factors have to be addressed by policymakers and by the industry in order to make the case.
Thank you very much, Timur. So I think that's all the questions we have so far. I'm just double checking. Yep, that's all that have come through in the Zoom Q&A. If you do have other questions, don't hesitate to reach out. You can reach us at press@iea.org, press@iea.org, and we'll be happy to get back for any other questions. Thank you for the great questions that you submitted. Thank you for your time listening to the presentations from Timur and Jose. Just a few things to flag up. Timur mentioned a couple of other reports and issues that we actually have coming up this week. Apologies for the steady stream of reports. It's a particularly active time for the IEA right now. One report is coming out on Wednesday, the 6th of October, the role of low carbon fuels in the clean energy transitions of the power sector. So that's out Wednesday. And then on Thursday, the 7th of October, a report about cutting methane emissions from fossil fuel operations by 2030 by 75%. That will be released on Thursday. So do reach out if you're interested in those reports. And obviously, next week is the release of the World Energy Outlook 2021 on the 13th of October. So thank you for your interest, and we look forward to talking to you again soon. And thank you to Jose and Timur for their presentations. Wish you all a good day. Thank you and goodbye.